From what I've read, the automatic transmission behind a 4-liter Cherokee is a very solid and capable transmission, but it tends to fail due to fluid breakdown due to excessive heat. So I picked up this tranny cooler since it's going to have a lot more power in front of it. It comes with a fan and a thermostatic switch to automatically kick it on when it starts getting hot. So here it is unboxed. I need to put a little bit of sealant on the switch. I've got some fittings on there. It comes with all these other fittings as well. It's pretty complete. I'm going to mount it up underneath the front end. I've got this Rusty's skid plate for the kind of engine area. I'm going to mount it on the engine side of that so it's protected from everything. Alright, I've got the cooler sitting about where I'm going to mount it, and it's a little bit more to the passenger side to protect it from the swing from the pitman arm, get it out of the way. But the problem I'm having is that fitting is rubbing on that torsion bar. It's a Curry anti-rock sway bar, and it's just going to contact with that. So I shot down to O'Reilly and picked up a box of these sway bar bushings. I'm just going to stack them 2 deep, and that'll give me a little bit of a buffer between the metal and the skid plate and the bracket there. Take care of some of the vibration, and should space it up high enough to get that out of the way. I'm just going to size these holes up to 5/16. Going to put a little bit of this Loctite thread sealant on the thermostatic switch and screw it into the fitting. Get it down there nice and snug. So I got all these holes punched out on the outside of the skid plate. Now I just went up to 21/64 to get these to line up a little bit easier with the bolts coming through there. Now just bring it around to the inside. This is what I ended up with. Decided to put them at a 90-degree angle, went down to ace, got a couple fittings and a O-ring. Since this just threads in, there's nowhere for it to bottom out on, I'm going to put this rubber O-ring on here and some thread sealant down the threads. Get that thing in there nice and snug. On these screw-in fittings, the shoulder was a little too tall. It was about twice that. So I couldn't get this tip to bottom out in there and make a seal. So I took them to the grinder and then cleaned up the threads so that they'll thread back in. Even though this will bottom out on there, I'm still going to use the thread sealant on there and just screw it in nice and tight. I'm going to try to angle them so that they'll head over towards the driver's side. The fitting with the O-ring on it and a little bit of thread sealant. The fitting with the switch and some thread sealant down here. Well, where it tightened up, the switch is facing down, but that's fine because I'll have enough clearance underneath the bottom, especially with the spacers on there, so it'll keep the wires out of everything. Good with that. And then this last fitting. So I got both sides on there, thread sealant at the right angle to get those hoses up and out of the way. Now I just need to wire it in. Here's the instructions it comes with. Alright, so here's how the wiring works. This comes from the fan. Blue's positive, black's negative, makes the fan spin. Thermostatic switch works. You get power from your ignition. When your key's on, it sends power to one side of the switch. When it gets hot, it connects the circuit to the other side, which then in turn goes to the blue wire in your fan. The ground is always grounded. You can hook this switch directly to 12-volt power and it's hot all the time, but the problem with that is if you shut this thing off while it's running, it's going to keep running until the ATF or whatever you got running through this oil, whatever, cools down. And with no circulation going, you're going to be cooling everything inside the little heat sink here, but not necessarily inside the tube. It's going to run for a long time. Not really effective. Another thing you can do is add a secondary wire going to this as well, so that say you're about to climb a hill, you're pulling a trailer or whatever, and you want to keep that tranny cold, just flip that switch on and it'll preemptively cool that fluid down. What I'm going to do is route this wire. I want it to tuck up here nice and neat, and I'm going to cut the blue positive wire to length so that it fits just right onto the switch. Start with cutting this connector off that I'm not going to use. That's about right. And strip back both ends of the cut blue wire and the one going to the fan. I'm going to add these cool little 90-degree spade connectors on there and crimp them down like so. Make sure they've got a nice pinch in there so they don't come out. Before I put the connector on this one, I want to measure the protective sheathing and cut it to length. Slip it over there. About like so. Then feed the ground wire back up through that same sheathing. Pull it out so that they're even. You want to put dielectric grease in the connectors that you're plugging in that are exposed to the elements. That'll keep the corrosion away longer. And just kind of snap them in. Give them a good healthy dosing of that stuff. You want to measure the distance on the remainder of that protective sheathing. Trim it. And then slip both wires in there. This is looking good. This is going to head on up to the headlight wire harness and then continue on up to my fuse block. And I'm going to use this to connect it. Just going to solder this in. It's got a black and a red. Makes it easy to identify. First thing you want to do is slide some larger heat shrink over both wires. Just a good section of it. I like to buy this stuff at Harbor Freight. It's cheap and it's effective. It works pretty well. Then 2 short sections on the individual wires. And strip the tips. It helps to cut the wires at different lengths so that when you heat shrink it down, it doesn't make the wire any thicker than it has to be. Right, so while your soldering gun's heating up, get these wires ready. Come twist them back opposite directions, slide them together, and then twist them back the way they were. Just try to keep it as low profile as possible. You don't want any ends hanging out. Now just wipe some solder on there. Just make sure that there's no sharp tips kind of hanging out that is going to poke through the heat shrink. And the same thing with the next wire, the ground. Keep it nice and tight. Not my best soldering job, but it'll definitely hold it. Sometimes the heat shrink will shrink up towards the end and you can just trim it just so you can slide it on there a little easier. I like to coat all my connectors and whatever I'm heat shrinking with liquid electric tape before I shrink them. Seems to seal it in a lot better. Pretty simple to use. Just kind of brush it on. And it helps to do a few thin coats, but since I'm going to heat shrink it, I'm just going to goop it in there, slide them over, and shrink it down. Well, I got the positive one on, went on real easy, but the negative one's just a little bit too big here at the end. It doesn't quite want to slide all the way over. That's okay. I'm just going to put some more goop on there before sliding the larger sleeve over it. Cover a little bit more on it. A lot bit more. And then slide that sucker on over. I'm gonna get some in the back end here too. Got it overlapping right here as well. This should be nice and watertight. Shrink it down. And you don't have to worry about this thing again. Alright, well it's ready to install. So here's how I'm going to bolt it together. I have the bolt with the washer coming up through the skid plate, through the urethane bushing, through the bracket, washer on the backside, locking nut on the backside. Sandwich it down. So I'm doing this without a helper. I'm going to put the bolt in place and then tape it just to hold it up there. That ought to work just to get me started. Alright, got it in there. I ended up doubling up the sway bar bushings underneath there to get a little bit more clearance for that torsion bar. But you can see on these fittings here, I've got tons of clearance. Alright, I know it's going to be kind of hard to see it in this video. This is the line that comes from the transmission with the hot fluid into the radiator, just like it always has. The line coming out of the transmission used to be this line here. This line goes to the inlet side of the secondary transmission cooler, the one we just installed, where the switch is. So when it's hot enough, it kicks that fan on and then comes back out cooled through this original line back to the transmission. Alright, now you can see the red and black wire traveling up the fender up to the firewall. I need to give the black ground, and the red needs to be a 12 volt power that's fused and only powered when the switch is in the on position. This is a HELA fuse block and relay center. They're modular, they snap together, you put your wires wherever you want them. I added this when I put the HELA H4 headlights in because you need a heavier gauge wire so you don't melt your factory wiring. I've got a few open slots in here in the fuse block that I can power this fan into to clean that up. I'm also going to put it into the headlight wire harness, but I'm going to do that on another video. Make a new block, get rid of all this junk, do it a lot cleaner. Oh, there it is, protected by the skid plate, hiding from the snow and everything else. Hopefully this will make my transmission last a little bit longer. Thanks for watching.